What if Ukraine's most decisive battles are no longer defined by sudden chaos, but by the relentless, suffocating silence that rarely makes headlines? The war is changing shape. All train traffic to Sloviansk and Kramatorsk has come to a halt, a sign that Ukrainian troops may be preparing for a significant withdrawal, or perhaps laying the groundwork for a deadly ambush. In Pokrovsk, the outlook has grown bleak. Ukrainian soldiers are surrendering in groups, supplies are nearly exhausted, and morale is eroding as food and ammunition dwindle to nothing. Across the front lines, the rhythm of combat is shifting. Heavy fighting still erupts in Kherson, Kupiansk, and Sumy, where the contact line quivers with uncertainty. But the confusion of recent months is fading. Russian advances now seem methodical, deliberate, step by step, rather than reckless or disorganized. Behind the scenes, Western involvement is quietly deepening. NATO planners are drafting new contingencies. Reports whisper of British instructors training Ukrainian units and clandestine aid increasing by the day. This is no longer a war of flashy maneuvers. It is a war of attrition, exhaustion, and evolving strategies, where every day brings new, hidden risks. Missing these subtle transformations means risking a fundamental misunderstanding, not only of this war, but of the shifting architecture of global security. The stakes stretch far beyond the battlefield. Political, strategic, and economic futures all hang in the balance. To truly understand how Ukraine's front reached this fragile tipping point, we must step back, tracing the hidden roots and hard realities that now shape the nation's fate. Before the headlines grew quiet and the trains stopped running, the seeds of this crisis were already sown. Let's rewind to the early months of the invasion, when every hour brought a new threat and a new choice. Inside Pokrovsk, why did hundreds of Ukrainian troops surrender, and what does this reveal about the true state of the war? Ukraine's war is now entering a harsher, more desperate stage. Pokrovsk, once a cornerstone of the Eastern Front, sits nearly encircled. Its defenders are stranded, cut off from new supplies, communication, and any realistic hope of rescue. In recent days, their position worsened so dramatically that for many, surrender became the only way to survive. Prisoners taken from Pokrovsk have begun to speak. Their accounts are grim. Days spent hungry, untreated wounds festering in the dark, and a near-total lack of medicine or bandages. Commanders vanished, leaving only confusion and fear. Russian artillery thundered day and night, while drones circled overhead, making every movement perilous. Russian tactics have been unrelenting. Drones and heavy shelling have severed every possible escape. Resupply convoys were destroyed before reaching the town. The last usable road, now called the Second Road of Death, is a corridor of burned vehicles and shell craters, marking the graveyard of failed relief efforts. The collapse at Pokrovsk is stunning in scale. In just the past few weeks, nearly 700 Ukrainian servicemen have surrendered here, a number unmatched since early in the year. For many, the decision was not about courage, but a stark realization. Their command structure had abandoned them, and surrender was the only option left to stay alive. This is not an isolated disaster. Across the line, Ukrainian logistics are unraveling. In Kherson, Russian troops have renewed river landings, forcing brutal close-quarters fighting. The town of Volchansk teeters on the edge, close to falling into Russian hands. Reinforcements are exhausted, and every attempt to break a siege is met with overwhelming Russian firepower. Misreading the scale of Ukraine's logistical crisis is to misunderstand the war's momentum and to overlook its mounting human toll. Each encircled battalion, each shattered road, shows a shift from dramatic clashes to a relentless, suffocating grind. But what is happening is more than a string of military setbacks. It marks a fundamental change in how the war is fought. Next, let's examine how these evolving tactics are changing the rules of the conflict itself. The events at Pokrovsk are just one sign of a larger transformation. To understand where the war is heading, we need to look at the new strategies now defining both sides. What happens when the very walls meant to protect become the bars of a cage? On Ukraine's battered front lines, this is no longer theory. It is daily reality. Fortifications once praised as symbols of resistance have become traps, stretched thin as the pool of fresh recruits dries up, and even engineers or railway workers are pressed into desperate service. From the outskirts of Pokrovsk to the battered approaches of Kharkiv, Ukrainian troops face a relentless, grinding pressure. The Russian advance is not swift, but it is remorseless. Block by block, once fierce battlefields are abandoned, and the old doctrine of holding urban fortresses at any cost is cracking. Recent surrenders, including the collapse of forces nearly the size of 2 battalions, signal more than tactical defeat. They reveal exhaustion, with supply lines choked off and essentials like food and medicine running perilously low. The psychological toll is mounting. Captured soldiers tell of endless days without rations, wounded left to fate, and commanders who disappear from contact as the promise of rescue evaporates. Those left behind face a stark choice: surrender or die in positions that have become little more than tombs under endless barrages of artillery and drones. Western analysts, once hopeful about Ukraine's ability to improvise, now speak more openly about the mounting losses. Even Ukrainian officials concede the fall of critical cities, and perhaps more importantly, the urgent need for a change in strategy. Rail links to key hubs like Sloviansk and Kramatorsk have been severed. Their stations sit eerily deserted. Whispers circulate about new defensive lines hastily dug farther west, beyond Donbass, suggesting Kiev's leaders may be preparing to yield ground to avoid further encirclements. This shift has not gone unnoticed outside Ukraine. In Western capitals, debate intensifies. Some NATO members contemplate sending peacekeepers or covert military advisors to pivotal cities like Odessa and Mykolaiv. There are reports, difficult to confirm, of British instructors already operating behind the lines, a sign of growing but quiet foreign involvement meant to shore up Ukraine's faltering defense. Yet as foreign hands reach further in, the dangers multiply. Russian officials, decrying what they describe as a soft invasion by Western operatives, now publicly discuss restarting nuclear weapons tests for the first time in more than 3 decades. Their message is unmistakable. As both sides adapt to exhaustion and changing tactics, the conflict is shifting toward a new, more perilous phase, one marked by greater uncertainty and higher stakes. The warning is unmistakable. Fail to see these patterns emerging, and the world risks being caught off guard. A slow-motion collapse could, with little warning, become a crisis with consequences far beyond these battle-scarred cities. As the lines blur between defense and disaster, the next moves from Kiev and its allies will be crucial. The question now is not just how long Ukraine can hold, but how far the conflict might escalate, and who will decide its course. The world holds its breath. Will this measured, relentless advance ignite a new era of warfare, or plunge Europe into chaos? Behind sealed doors, arguments over NATO's role grow sharper. Official statements deny any direct plans, yet detailed strategies for bolder action are being drafted in secret. Rumors swirl about Western instructors and covert coordination on Ukrainian soil, a veiled signal that the threshold for intervention is shifting. Russia, meanwhile, braces for a drawn-out confrontation. Sweeping reforms in mobilization and a massive expansion of its defense industry suggest the Kremlin expects this war to stretch for many years. Gone are hopes of quick victories. Now, each side prepares to endure, amassing supplies and digging in for a test of wills. On the Ukrainian front, exhaustion gnaws at morale. Forward units, undersupplied and isolated, face grim decisions. Civilian leaders, haunted by mounting losses and the relentless strain, begin, quietly and off the record, to hint at the need for negotiations or painful compromise. Yet, whispers grow louder of peacekeeping troops from outside powers. Framed as a step toward stability, such deployments threaten to blur the line between peace mission and war, risking direct clashes and unleashing unpredictable escalations across the region. Social media erases any illusion of distance. Unfiltered images of families huddled in darkness, medics stretched past breaking, and ghostly cities drive home the war's cost. What began as a hoped-for short, decisive conflict has stolen years of ordinary life from millions. Fatigue is everywhere, on the battlefield, in kitchens, in city streets. Both Ukrainians and Russians tire of grim headlines, empty shelves, and the suffocating uncertainty of endless war. The wider world, overwhelmed by suffering and stalemate, risks turning away, missing signs of a new, far more dangerous phase. Now, both sides appear resigned to a slow, grinding struggle. Though the tempo has slowed, every move carries lasting consequences, and the risks for Europe and the world only grow more severe. With the old certainties fading, a new kind of war is taking shape in real time. The next moves from Moscow, Kyiv, and Western capitals could determine not just the outcome, but the nature of conflict in the 21st century. How do you stay sharp when every headline is engineered to shake your sense of reality? In modern war, information is not just background noise, it is the battlefield itself. Propaganda, conflicting reports, and relentless updates threaten to overwhelm you. The first rule is simple: critical thinking is your shield. When facts blur and emotions spiral, pause. Ask, who gains from this narrative? What truths are left unsaid? And what do outside sources, those with no stake in the fight, agree on? We crave dramatic twists or sudden collapses, but real wars are rarely decided overnight. Progress is usually slow, methodical, a grind marked by attrition, patience, and logistics. What appears to be a pause is often a quiet struggle for supply lines, resources, or territory. Recent events in Ukraine reveal that the most decisive moments come in weeks of pressure. A rail line cut, a supply depot emptied, a town lost after days of tension rather than a single explosion. Both soldiers and civilians are being forced to adapt to this grinding, uncertain new phase. Resilience is not a slogan, it is daily survival. For soldiers, it means fighting through shortages, broken communications, and exhausting routines. For civilians, it means enduring blackouts, empty stores, and the constant fear of shifting front lines. Over weeks and months, this constant uncertainty frays nerves and shakes communities, demanding the invention of new habits just to endure. The true cost of modern conflict hides in the ordinary. Empty shelves at the market, deserted train stations, silent neighbors. These are the wounds no headline captures. Psychological stress builds as rumors swirl and trust evaporates, not just in leaders, but between neighbors. When daily life is unpredictable, even small routines, finding bread, sharing supplies, reading the news, become acts of quiet resistance. Picture the battlefield as a vast chessboard. The flashy moves grab attention, but victory comes from isolating villages, disrupting logistics, and positioning reserves. Patience and calculation count more than heroics. The armies that endure are those who learn the new rules, managing resources and morale with relentless focus. So how do you stay informed without becoming overwhelmed or manipulated? Limit your intake of sensational stories. Seek out diverse, credible sources, and step back regularly. Feeling lost is normal. Clarity comes from asking difficult questions, resisting knee-jerk reactions, and valuing context over instant outrage. Skepticism is your best defense. If you do not build these habits, you risk being swept away by misinformation or losing the ability to think clearly in crisis. In this phase, your mind is your sharpest weapon. As this new phase unfolds, every choice, on and off the battlefield, will shape outcomes far beyond the front lines. As the stakes escalate, the fog of war only thickens. The coming days will test not just armies, but the resolve and judgment of everyone watching. The true endgame rarely shouts its name in headlines. Instead, it hides in the quiet gaps between reports, in details buried beneath the surface. Today's battlefield is obscured not only by smoke, but by stories. Bold headlines trumpet advances or retreats, but the real story emerges from subtle changes. A supply line suddenly cut, a commander told to hold at all costs, a front gone eerily silent. War has become a test of endurance and adaptation, less about sweeping victories and more about outlasting the opponent. If you focus only on the noise, you risk losing the plot. Russian pushes and Ukrainian withdrawals are not always what they seem. Each side maneuvers like chess masters, conserving strength, calculating every move, sometimes feinting, sometimes bluffing. What looks like collapse may be a ruse. What feels like triumph may set a trap. International players quietly move pieces, shifting outcomes in ways invisible to the public. What is truly at stake is clarity. Modern war is waged not just with tanks and drones, but with narratives. Some honest, some carefully engineered. Swallow every headline, and you give up your ability to discern, to anticipate, to see what truly shapes the endgame. To understand, you must read between the lines. Ask what is missing. Notice which patterns repeat, which suddenly break. The real story of this war and of future conflicts unfolds in gradual, grinding shifts. Exhausted brigades, deserted train stations, decisions made in unseen rooms. This is about more than territory. It is a struggle for perception, control, and the future of global influence. Your understanding is vital. The gap between clarity and confusion will decide not just how you interpret this war, but how you recognize the warning signs of the next crisis. In the end, victory or defeat may not hinge on who occupies a particular city, but on who adapts first to a world that refuses to stand still. But to truly grasp the significance of these developments, we must look not only at the present, but at the echoes of history and the concrete realities on the ground. This is not the first time a major European war has entered a grinding phase, nor is it the first time that the world has watched, uncertain, as new rules of conflict are written. Consider the First World War. When that conflict began in 1914, both sides envisioned a short, decisive campaign, a quick march to victory. Yet by the winter of 1915, the Western Front had bogged down into an endless slog of trenches, attrition, and stalemate. Supply lines became as critical as courage. Railways, much like those now halted in Sloviansk and Kramatorsk, became lifelines for armies and populations alike. As the months dragged on, the difference between victory and defeat was measured not in heroic charges, but in the ability to feed, arm, and reinforce exhausted troops. The echoes of that era reverberate in today's Ukraine, where the battle for logistics may decide the war. Or look at the siege of Leningrad during the Second World War. The city was surrounded for nearly 900 days, and its survival depended on a single supply route known as the Road of Life. When that route was threatened, hunger and desperation spread like wildfire. In modern Pokrovsk, the so-called Second Road of Death is a grim reminder that the fate of entire cities can rest on a handful of highways and the courage of those who attempt to keep them open, even as drones and artillery turn every journey into a gamble with death. The lessons of history are not just academic. They offer practical guidance for both armies and civilians. When supply lines are at risk, contingency plans become essential. Military leaders must anticipate encirclement, pre-position caches of food and medical supplies, and develop fallback positions. For civilians, knowledge of evacuation routes, stockpiling essential goods, and maintaining communication networks can mean the difference between survival and disaster. Today, with Russian forces pressing on multiple fronts, the Ukrainian command faces dilemmas familiar to generals throughout history. Should they hold every inch of ground, risking encirclement and mass surrender, or retreat to more defensible positions and preserve their fighting strength? The answer is not simple, and each choice carries costs. In 1940, during the fall of France, the decision to abandon Paris without a fight preserved lives but ceded the capital to the enemy. In contrast, the defense of Stalingrad, though costly beyond measure, became a turning point. A reminder that sometimes holding at all costs is both a gamble and a statement to the world. The current silence along the rails to Sloviansk and Kramatorsk may mask frantic activity behind the scenes. Ukrainian engineers and volunteers, working by night, could be fortifying new defensive lines or preparing scorched earth tactics to deny resources to the enemy. Western advisors, drawing on doctrines developed during the Cold War, may be helping to coordinate these efforts. The presence of British instructors, if confirmed, would recall the role that foreign advisors played in earlier conflicts, from the American military mission in Greece after the Second World War, to the covert support given to Afghan resistance fighters during the 1980s Soviet occupation. In each case, outside expertise and resources tipped the balance, but always at the risk of escalation and blowback. For ordinary Ukrainians, the reality of this phase is both terrifying and mundane. Picture a family in a small town west of the Dnipro River. They wake before dawn to check for news. Has the front moved? Is the train still running? In the market, shelves are emptier each week. Neighbors share rumors. A convoy was destroyed. The next town is under shell fire. Someone's son has not returned from the east. Children play in basements, their laughter echoing off concrete walls that now serve as bomb shelters. In the evenings, families gather by candlelight, rationing not just bread and sugar, but hope itself. For soldiers, the grind is unrelenting. Imagine a platoon on the outskirts of Kherson. Each night, they dig new trenches, patch uniforms, and count ammunition. Communications are sporadic. Sometimes the only news comes from intercepted radio chatter or hurried notes smuggled past enemy lines. The fear is not just of death, but of being forgotten, left behind as the front shifts and priorities change. In such conditions, discipline and camaraderie are both fragile and precious. A single act of kindness, a shared cigarette, a joke, a letter from home, can sustain morale for days. But as losses mount and reinforcements dwindle, even the strongest units can fracture. The psychological effects ripple outward. In the towns behind the front, teachers and doctors struggle to maintain a semblance of normality. School lessons are interrupted by air raid sirens. Hospitals improvise with dwindling supplies, reusing bandages and rationing painkillers. The stress is cumulative, and invisible wounds may linger long after the shooting stops. In past conflicts, the aftermath of prolonged siege and uncertainty led to lasting trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, broken families, and lost generations. The world must prepare not only to count the dead, but to care for the living. As international actors weigh their options, historical precedents offer both warnings and guidance. The introduction of peacekeepers, whether in the Balkans in the 1990s or in Cyprus decades earlier, has sometimes stabilized fronts, but just as often created new flashpoints. The line between observer and combatant is perilously thin. Should NATO troops enter Ukrainian cities, even in small numbers, the risk of miscalculation would be enormous. A stray artillery shell or a misunderstood order could ignite a wider conflagration, drawing in neighboring states and raising the specter of a truly continental war. At the strategic level, the shift to attritional warfare changes the calculus for Russia as well. The Kremlin's mobilization of industry and the expansion of conscription recall the Soviet Union's efforts during the Great Patriotic War. Factories in the Urals once ran day and night to produce tanks and artillery. Today, the same urgency drives the production of drones, missiles, and ammunition. The logistical demands are staggering, feeding, arming, and supplying hundreds of thousands of troops across a vast front. Every truckload of shells, every train car of diesel becomes a small victory, or a potential point of failure. For Western nations, the challenge is equally daunting. Sanctions and aid packages must be calibrated to sustain Ukraine without provoking unwanted escalation. Political leaders face restive publics, weary of headlines and skeptical of open-ended commitments. In the United States, debates echo those of the Vietnam era. How much support is enough, and at what point does involvement become intervention? The lessons of Afghanistan, where years of aid and training failed to prevent a swift collapse, are fresh in many minds. Yet, to abandon Ukraine would risk emboldening adversaries elsewhere, from the Baltic to the South China Sea. The information war is as fierce as the battles on the ground. State media, social networks, and unofficial channels all compete to shape perception. Deepfake videos, falsified casualty reports, and coordinated disinformation campaigns muddy the waters. The average viewer, bombarded by contradictory narratives, must develop new skills to discern truth from fiction. Media literacy, once an academic concern, is now a matter of survival. Schools, news organizations, and tech companies have a role to play, developing tools to flag falsehoods, teaching critical thinking, and supporting independent journalism. Individuals, too, can take steps, verifying sources, cross-checking reports, and resisting the pull of outrage and confirmation bias. In practical terms, resilience is built from the ground up. Community organizations can organize food drives, share generators, and coordinate local defense. Religious groups, cultural associations, and neighborhood committees all have a part to play in maintaining cohesion. Governments can support these efforts by ensuring the flow of accurate information, providing mental health resources, and streamlining aid distribution. International agencies, from the Red Cross to Doctors Without Borders, should be given safe passage to deliver medical care and humanitarian relief. The experience of Sarajevo in the 1990s, a city under siege, sustained by international airlifts and local ingenuity, shows that even in the bleakest circumstances, solidarity can save lives. Looking ahead, the outcome of this phase will depend on decisions made by leaders and citizens alike. Will Ukraine's defenders adapt, trading ground for time and preserving their core? Will Russia press its advantage, or overextend and face a counteroffensive? Will Western nations remain united, or fracture under the weight of competing interests? Each scenario has historical analogs. Each carries lessons, risks, and opportunities. As individuals, the best defense is vigilance, both against misinformation and against resignation. History's most dangerous moments often come not with a bang, but with a sigh, with the slow acceptance of new realities. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and stay connected to the wider world. In the end, the battles for cities and rail lines are also battles for memory, meaning, and the promise of a future beyond war. In summary, the war in Ukraine is entering a phase defined not by sudden reversals, but by the quiet accumulation of hardship, adaptation, and strategic recalculation. The lessons of history, the realities on the ground, and the choices of millions will together shape what comes next. In the fog of war, clarity is both the rarest and most precious resource. Guard it well, for it may decide not only the fate of Ukraine, but the future of us all.